Okay, good morning, everybody, on this hot and steamy day. This week, I'm beginning to move further into the 20th century. The 20th century, which was monumental for the loss of human life in wars, Spanish flu, huge personalities, which we will deal with all of them. And today, I'm starting especially in the area of Russia. Now, Russia was an empire which, at its time, at a certain particular period, was an empire which occupied three different continents, including North America at one time. And it continued in that way until 1917. And the 20th century would see the loss of numerous empires around the world, which we will touch on. Now, the Tsars, who controlled Russia, controlled it through oppression and repression. And millions of Russian serfs existed there at the whim of those who were in control of their serfs. They owned no land, they had no rights, and they lived in a state of severe poverty. Now, hatred towards the Tsars increased with time. There were numerous attempts at assassination of different Tsars. Mind you, there were numerous attempts at assassination of in democratic countries such as England, and attempts on Queen Victoria. So we come now to an amazing amount of resentment which flared up against the Tsars, and at the same time, they were also suppressed by the Okhrana, who were the secret police. And the secret police had phenomenal ability to control the millions of Russians by killing, hanging, shooting, and any other method which they would use as they investigated the secrets of people, even when they didn't know they were being investigated. Today, we are looking at Tsar Nicholas II. Tsar Nicholas II, who would be not quite the last Tsar, technically speaking, but we'll refer to him as the last Tsar until 1917. And Tsar Nicholas II, not following on to the liberal moves of Alexander II, who was assassinated in 1881, and who in St. Petersburg, and the Church of Spilled Blood is there on the spot where he was shot. Tsar Nicholas II thought mistakenly that if he oppressed the people even more, that was the way to control the millions of Russians. And he made everything worse. But not only did he have a disastrous policy at home, despite any attempt to control the man who was there at the whim, of course he was a representative of God himself, he also had a disastrous foreign policy. There were, at that time, overcrowding, slums, and appalling factory conditions. And this is what people resented, and numerous individuals in different parts of Russia moved towards better situation, like an 8-hour working day, which would have been good. And there were revolutionary movements all over Russia at this particular time. They weren't the people just devotion to the Tsar, but they were there to appease, as it were, the peasants and the proletariat. And we begin to get a rise in Marxism and a desire for social improvement. But the Tsar would allow for no particular compromise, and the distance between the Tsar and his policies and the people and their desires grew further and further apart. Movements developed. There were the liberals. They wanted peaceful reform, which the Tsar rejected. They wanted to move towards revolution, not necessarily with violence, some without violence. And in 1898, the Russian Social Democrat Party established itself and then began by 1911 to split into two halves. There were the Bolsheviks, based on the word majority, and they were aggressive party of workers who wanted immediate revolution, and there were the Mensheviks, from the word for minority, and they were a party that wanted revolution gentler. than the majority Bolsheviks. And the masses used two weapons against the Tsars on a regular basis. There was armed rebellion wherever they could, and they went on strike. And went on strike, they did all over Russia, whether it was St. Petersburg or many, many other places. At the same time, as the treatment of the serfs, and after, of course, the whole idea of a serf was removed, but of the Russian peasants, there was also the treatment of the Jews. Now, the Jews were in a particular position because Tsar Nicholas II, despite what you may have seen as this kindly man in the films Nicholas and Alexandra, and how lovely they are with their lovely children and their hemophiliac son, and what wonderful people they were, he was a rabid anti-Semite. He viewed Jews as the lowest of the low, and Alexandra, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, also had a virulent anti-Semitic attitude. So the Tsar's opposition grew amongst Jews, and it's natural and it's understandable. The Jews would naturally be very, very involved in revolution against the Tsar. The Jews, in a way, had nothing to lose. They wanted a better life. They wanted something which could be an advancement on what they had. By 1904, the Tsar's opposition due to his policies came from all sectors. The liberals opposed him. The socialists, who would become, of course, known as Marxists, opposed him. And the Jews opposed him as well. Now, if there was a disastrous policy at home, a domestic world, the Tsar also had a disastrous foreign policy. He believed that if you wanted to take away the peasants' view of him in a negative sense, then he could advance himself by, and is used many times in history, where people will try and have a foreign campaign in order to get the people behind him. And although there was Russification, as it was called, in all the Baltic states of Estonia, Livonia, Lithuania, Poland, and Finland, he looked to Japan. And in 1904, he would go to war against Japan. Nicholas II and most of the leaders of the army in Russia viewed the Japanese as little yellow men who were totally and absolutely useless. And there is absolutely no way that the Japanese could offer any way of defending themselves against the Russians. At that time, they were looking at Korea and Manchuria. And the Russians said, we will take over Manchuria. And Japan said, we will take over Korea. But at the same time, Russia was looking to take over Manchuria and Korea. The demands, therefore, they went to war against Japan, and it was an absolute disaster. Here was Russia, who believed that the Japanese were not worth anything at all, totally destroyed the Russian Navy before they even moved in a numerous wars which went on in 1904, 1905. And on each occasion, thousands of Russian sailors were killed. The demands for reform, the demand for parliamentary change grew in Russia because of foreign policy, which many may have not even known about, but also what was going on. 1905, families and strikers would decide to march on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, that magnificent city established by Peter the Great. And on the 22nd of January, in the cold and the snow, led by Georgy Gapon, who was a well-known priest amongst those who would rebel, as it were, against the Tsar, they marched there against the Winter Palace in order to put forward their demands. Their demands were not so special. They just wanted better facilities, better amenities, better life for the proletariat and for the peasants. They wanted to have, as I said, an 8-hour working day and other more usable facilities. They marched forward, and the Tsar was then faced with thousands of peasants moving forward by this Gapon, this priest, who was supported by Pinchas Rosenblum. Now, Pinchas Rosenblum, who you probably never heard of, and who would have heard of him, but actually was quite an individual who fought on the side of the protesters against the Tsar and was known to Gapon himself. They moved forward, and the Tsar could have attacked using different types of troops, but he allowed his own guards to fire on Bloody Sunday, and an absolute massacre became the most famous massacre known as Bloody Sunday happened. The numbers killed are debated. It may have been 200 to 300, but others would say that 1,500 were actually shot, wounded, massacred, cut down in that square in front of the Winter Palace. So instead of being a total state of depression, the Tsar went off and he had lunch, as one does, of course, having just been responsible for the massacring of your own people. Pinchas Rosenblum was the man who therefore removed Gapon, who survived, by being dragged out and taken away from the masses who were there in front of the Winter Palace. Eventually the Tsar, under pressure, decided there would be a Duma, a parliament, something not even democratic, but something touching on the concept of democracy, that they would have a parliament where people could put forward their views and discuss issues. And there was a Duma, a parliament in 1906, 1907, 1912. It was a complete sham. It never survived. It was, in fact, dissolved by the Tsar. And instead of giving in to the demands of the masses, the Tsar now, with a disastrous foreign policy, with a disastrous Bloody Sunday, with a disastrous approach to the masses of Russians, increased the amount of repression. And therefore, amongst the revolutionary, they got together and they called themselves, and councils, and they called themselves the Soviets. The word Soviet being the Russian word for a council. And from 1905, we now see the word Soviet entering into the Russian language. Others, famous people, began to come forward. Trotsky emerged. Emotionally affected by the events which had happened, he was unable to contain himself in what he had actually seen. The foreign policy now comes, and of course Trotsky, who wrote War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, was one of the most famous individuals in Russia. So we have Russia in a state of complete breakdown, and at the same time, we're now looking towards Germany on the other side of the border. Now, the foreign nations were also looking at Russia. They feared Russia in many ways, and you begin to move what would become ultimately the Great European War. Of course, it wasn't known as the First World War. It only became known as the First World War after the Second World War. Now, Germany was a different country altogether. It saw itself as a country of culture, industrialists and scientists, and a German spirit. And there was a country which, if you looked at it in one way, would be an absolute golden country for Jews. The success of Jews, half Jews, part Jews, was phenomenal. Everybody from Einstein downwards. And they would see this as the ultimate. However, it was also a country of much anti-Semitism. Now, the Germans saw themselves, quoting, as being thoroughly efficient, confident, patriotic, and ruthless. And they had a strong military tradition. And the one thing that Bismarck had always stated is that Germany must never have enemies on both sides. And if you look at the film of the Second World War, that's exactly what happened in the Second World War, where the Russians were advancing from the east and the British, Americans, and Canadians were advancing from the west through France. And this is exactly what had always been fearful for the Reich, for the Germans, that you somehow would have enemies on both borders. Now, Bismarck always worked, and he did it very well, to juggle European powers to Germany's benefit. Yes, they could be a strong country, but they wouldn't be able to withstand enemies both on the east, the Russians, and of course on the other side. In 1881, there was a triple alliance where Germany and Austria and Italy joined together. Italy was always a fairly ineffectual partner, and things didn't really change at any point during the 20th century. Italy was always fairly ineffectual. And France, the eternal enemy, that would be isolated. But Emperor Wilhelm II, part of the cousinhood of the Kaiser, the King, and the Emperor, all grandsons of Queen Victoria, undid the political scheming of Bismarck. And the Emperor offended Russia and England. And by 1895, the very thing that Bismarck had always worked against was having two fronts at that time against Germany. And so whilst there was a triple alliance, you then had in 1895 a dual alliance, which was where Russia and France came together. So the very thing that they never wanted, the Germans now had. They had enemies, as it were, on both borders. Now, Germany, a bit like Russia in some ways at that particular time before the First World War, also believed they had a superior army and that neither the Russians nor the French would be a problem, and that if any war happened, they would defeat those enemies fairly quickly. By 1907, because of the relationship between England and France, it became a triple alliance. So England now found itself in the triple alliance of Russia, France, and England all together against Germany, Austria, and Italy. Now, that was not a natural situation. Germany was not our natural enemy, as we will come to. Germany, in fact, has strong connection with our royal family. Our royal family's roots were in Germany. Their very name at that time, up to 1917, was German. And many people felt a natural affiliation with Germany much more than they did against Russia or for Russia. As far as the Jews were concerned, again, Russia was our natural enemy because of the treatment of the Jews, and Germany was our natural friend because of the situation in that particular country and the advancement of the Jews to phenomenal heights in Germany. But the major armies of the world continued to arm. Germany wanted to control the seas. Britain was seen as the nation, the empire to control the seas, and they just went into an arms race. At that time, there was a great rise in nationalism. Belgium, there were moves, Norway, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Poles, Czechs, Croats, everybody, not everybody, many, many nations all around Europe were building up revolutionary movements and were all looking to tear themselves away from the controlling empires and to assert their own independence. Germany preached war. They said, now is the time for us to attack. Now is our time to attack against Russia, which is inept. So as the Russians said the Japanese were inept, so the Germans said the Russians were inept. And they had, based on Darwinian principles, the survival of the fittest, that if there was to be a war, then Germany preaching war would be a quick victory. It would defeat the Russians very quickly. At that time, the Ottoman Empire was also breaking up. So as the First World War came about, Zionism was also beginning to grow in the Jewish world. By 1908, there was a revolution in the Ottoman Empire, and there was an awakening of Arab nationalism. So we can begin to see at the beginning of the 20th century, the world is in disarray. There was Serbian aggression, There was Bosnia and Herzegovina, and all these different nations were there, but not that important. Then, as we come to a shortened end for today's talk, on June the 28th, 1914, Archduke Prince Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. That didn't necessarily have to have a profound meeting. It could have been that that issue would have just disappeared and not been of any particular significance. But each of the surrounding nations, the Serbs, the Bosnians, therefore the Russians, and the Russians, therefore the Germans, and the Germans, therefore the Austrians, and all of them finally got involved, so that by 1914 we came to the Great War. And in September, we will carry on looking at the situation of Russia. And I wish all of you, I know it's a bit shorter today, but had an appointment. So I wish all of you a very, very good day, a very good summer, and I look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you very much.